Hello everybody and welcome to another board game discussion video. Today's topic is all about players playing nicely. Before I get started though, if you haven't done so already, please take a look at all of my various social media pages as well as my Patreon page. On all of those you'll be able to interact with myself and my channel in a whole bunch of really cool ways. So jumping right into it, being nice within a board game. So what I mean by this is essentially how the players interact with one another on the board itself. Are you attacking or are you sort of turtling up and not trying to interact with anybody? Are you letting people know that they're about to make a mistake, or do you just sort of take advantage of the mistake and go in and just take them down and all that kind of thing? And it's kind of interesting because this has potential ramifications for how board gaming or how board gamers are viewed by the general populace, because you can be viewed as somebody who's overly nice, overly mean, or whatever in between type of thing. So I'm really excited to discuss this primarily in the context of different games and different players and all of this kinds of thing. So what I wanted to do is talk about three primary topics here. First and foremost, I wanted to talk about niceness in the context of the game itself. Second, I wanted to talk about niceness in the context of who you're playing with. And third, I wanted to talk sort of generally about being too nice or too mean depending on a particular situation, and discuss a little bit more about the general ramifications of how things can go. So that said, before I get started with my personal rant, you guys know I love to hear from you. What are your own opinions on this type of thing? How do you view it from the context of a game perspective, from a player perspective, or just in general board gaming? How do you see it for yourself as a player, or whatever you want to do? Please let me know anything and everything in the comments below. But with that, we're going to jump right into it, talking about being nice in the context of games. So in general, games have some kind of competitive element. That's kind of the point to them. And that means that you're going to be attacking, you're going to be taking land or resources or something along those lines. And so that is how you play the game. And the problem is that this can be viewed as something that can be overly aggressive. And it can get a little bit hairy in that sense. And I'll give you guys a few examples. So, for example, we have something like this, Sheriff of Nottingham. We have these very negotiation-heavy type games. And in the case of Sheriff of Nottingham, it's about, are you going to try to call people out and inspect the bags to see whether they're bluffing or not? Now, in terms of looking at this as a game, it's not necessarily about being nice or mean. It's more about, can you read your opponents? But at the same time, you could just be quote unquote nice and let everybody pass through without any issues, or you can be quote unquote mean and inspect everybody's bag, but then you potentially lose a lot of your gold. So it's not necessarily advantageous. That said, more often than not, if you have a Euro style game, for example, something like Dominant Species, this is a game that is designed to be competitive. I mean, for crying out loud, it's called Dominant Species. The entire point of the evolutionary chain and, speciation in general is survival of the fittest. And so that means if you're just all over sulking in your corner, just being by yourself, you're not going to be able to survive. You're going to be out of the game, essentially. This is also all about territory control. If you're not going out and actively getting territory, then nothing's really going to happen. The interesting thing about this particular game, though, is that there is definitely the mechanic of, if you don't do it, you will be eliminated. So in that sense, you have to play the game the way that it's meant to be played. You have to go out, you have to be aggressive. And the fact is that everybody essentially at the table has to be able to realize that, but that's more for part number 2. So moving right along with my next little example here is Dominion, specifically Dominion Intrigue. Whenever I talk about Dominion on my channel, I talk about intrigue compared to the original. In the original game, you have very, very little character interaction or player interaction. You've got the moat, and then I think you have 1 or 2 attack cards, and that's it. Everything else is more the passive-aggressive, very Euro style, oh, you wanted to buy that card, I'm so sorry, type of thing. What Intrigue does is it adds a lot more attack cards. But again, this comes down to, if you've got 30% attack cards available on the board, you can't be necessarily upset when people start using them to attack you. You have to realize that this is part of the game. This is something that is essentially supposed to happen, and it's built into it. And yes, you can play a little bit more passively, and of course there are strategies, especially in a game like Dominion where you've got massive deck building, that you can do something that doesn't necessarily involve attacking your fellow players, but they very rarely work because going after your other players tends to be much more lucrative. And that said, is it necessarily a good or bad thing? It's tough to say. Next up, the one that I wanted to talk about is Axis and Allies. This very famously, of course, is a huge war game. Well, quote-unquote war game, all right? But the idea is that you have people playing as the Axis powers, people playing as the Allied powers in World War II, and you're going off, you're attacking each other, pushing for more territory, and it's essentially Risk on steroids. It's a much better version of Risk. It's what Risk wishes that it could be. The problem is that in this game, unlike in Dominant Species, if you just sort of sit around and don't do anything, nothing is going to happen to you. And that sucks, because you can sit there for literally hours and hours and hours and not have anything happen in the game, because everybody's just happy and content to sit around and effectively not play it. And this is where it really gets frustrating in terms of the context of the game. Yes, you're supposed to go out and attack. You're supposed to do this. You're supposed to work it this way. And if you don't do it, it's not necessarily harming you directly, but it's not moving the game forward, and on top of that, you're not progressing towards winning, which one would argue is the end goal of the games, regardless of what type of game it is. The next one that I wanted to talk about here is Cash and Guns. So the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I have a little story about it. The very first time that I ever played this, I was sort of the butt of the jokes at my old job, and when we first played this, on the very first round, everybody pointed their guns at me. For those of you who haven't played this game, the idea is that you're bank robbers trying to split loot. Whoever is down doesn't get a split of the loot, and so that means that you have to split it evenly with everybody who's still up. So what happened is literally everybody at the table pointed at me, and I was like, I surrender. So I went down. The problem was that they couldn't split the loot evenly. So immediately after that, the second round, we went and we started playing the game the way it's more meant to be played, which is not focusing on singular people, but instead going after multiple people simultaneously and just sort of seeing who's winning, who do I suspect is a police officer, all that kind of thing. So it's really nice, and I really appreciate games like that that sort of have that self-correcting type of thing, where if you play it in a way that is not necessarily not accurate, but not optimal, then it doesn't exactly punish you, but it sort of just makes you say like, oh, well, shoot, that did me no good. So then you can do it again differently later on. And the fact that it's sort of self-correcting like that is a huge help, and it means that it can sort of communicate that to everybody at the table. Next up in terms of games is co-op games. So obviously there's a ton of different co-op games. I've got a few up here somewhere. All over the place. There's Defenders of the Realm right there. I didn't bring out any examples, but with these games, of course, we have to work together. We have to all work towards the same goal. We're all trying to get the same thing done, but the problem then becomes, do we have a traitor, for example, with Dead of Winter or Shadows over Camelot and games like that? If you have that type of a mechanic, then yeah, you want to find the person who's actively working against you, but at the same time, you all still need to try to work towards the goal. So the betrayer might want to be a little mean, but everybody else needs to not so much do that. So it becomes a really delicate and fun balance that the games can accomplish. Moving right along to my point number 2, which is being nice to players. The major thing that I wanted to mention with this is new players, because far more often than not, new players are going to get discouraged if they essentially get beaten to a pulp by more experienced players. I've done a couple of videos on this idea, where do you necessarily want to take it easy on the new players? Not inherently, but at the same time, you don't want to, punish them every step of the way and make sure that they know full well every mistake that they made. That said, especially if you're going to be playing a game like Power Grid or some other reasonably heavy Euro game, mid to mid high weight game, then at least for me, whenever I'm doing that, especially with a newer person, then I'll say, oh, you might not want to do that because I might go here and do this, this, and this, and this. Just as a helpful suggestion. You can do whatever you want, but at the same time, trying to help them a little bit with strategy. It's a very difficult balance to maintain because I don't want to seem like, the D-bag who's telling them what to do because they're playing. But at the same time, I don't want them to be discouraged from continuing to play board games because they end up getting beaten relatively badly and they're just like, oh, shoot, well, that sucks. So an example of this, again, a game that I didn't bring out, but is Twilight Struggle. The first couple of times that I played this game with a friend of mine, I completely destroyed him. I mean, we're talking about like a round 2 victory. And it's just because he really didn't know a lot of the subtleties to the game. But to his credit, he was just like, oh, this is awesome. It's so much fun. And he took it as a learning experience, which is really the way that you should take games like this. And, well, I say you should. Obviously, everybody's different and, everybody's going to take it the way that they want to take it. But that's why I say you want to have at least somewhat of a light touch when it comes to newer players. That said, more experienced players, especially if it's like a regular gaming group and you meet with your diplomacy group every year or whatever it is, have at it and just go all out. But at the same time, also when it comes to players, is that you don't want to not play the game. I mentioned before, Axis and Allies, Dominant Species, these types of things. You want to play the game the way it's intended. You might not want to be super aggressive about it, but you don't want to have everybody just skate by and not get anything done, right? So moving right along into my third and final point is my general opinion on this whole thing, as well as most importantly, its ramifications for board gaming in general, within the public view especially. So you guys have heard my opinion on most of this, and that is to say, play the game the way it's meant to be. And most importantly, if you are on the receiving end of some badness, don't take it personally. These are games. They're meant to be fun. If you're going to be playing a game like Twilight Struggle or Twilight Imperium or Dominant Species or Axis and Allies, you're going to get attacked. If you don't get attacked, or if you don't attack somebody yourself, you're playing it wrong. And I hate to say it so bluntly, but that's the way it is. And it frustrates me a little bit, at least when I play with people who are just like very seriously saying, I can't believe you did that. I can't believe you attacked me. This game is so terrible. I hate it. You get the sarcastic people who's just like, oh man, why'd you do that? I hate you. There's a difference in the tonality there. Like, I have people who literally get upset at me when I do something that makes sense in the game and my position. And it becomes very frustrating to play with people like that because I'm just like, well, what did you expect me to do? I needed to advance my position, and in part, that can mean something that is detrimental to your position because then I go even farther, relatively speaking. As far as the ramifications for the board games in general, like I mentioned with regard to players, especially new players, we don't want to discourage them. We don't want to be hyper aggressive. We also don't want to be, we don't want to make it a boring game. And it can be an exceedingly difficult balance to strike. That said, if you're playing a good board game, then the game itself will not necessarily be completely self-correcting, but it will present itself as something that's like, okay, I see what I need to do. I can see how I have to progress. And of course, if you're able to give, especially the newer people, some tips and tricks and a little bit of strategy advice just to help them out, at least initially, and it should help everybody immensely. But again, the last thing we want to do as board gamers is to scare new potential players off, because that's the worst thing that we can do. We always want to have new people. We always want to share our amazing hobby with as many people as possible. But that said, thank you very, very much for watching. As always, once again, please let me know any and all of your thoughts in the comments below. What do you find interesting about being nice or mean in a board game, and why? And how do you approach it, whether it's a specific game style or players or whatever it happens to be. Please just let me know in the comments. You guys know I love hearing from you. But that said, thank you very much again for watching, and I will see you next time.